And we are live.
Awesome. Great. Really excited to be in here as well. So let me set the stage. So I hope everybody able to listen to us carefully. If we have some glitches in our voices or anything, please share this on the chat section. So we'll be monitoring and we fix things up if this is any trouble. So I have a wonderful panel with me. Taylor, over to you now. Give us of some of your recent visits, some of your quick, fresh intro about where you are and where you're busy these days.
Yeah, so great to see you all. I'm really excited for the conversations today and kind of like sharing what we're going to talk about around development, teams, operations, infrastructure. I'm currently in the clouds, as you can see, Simon. Um, that's where my head always is. I've been on the road going to DevOps days in Ljubljana. It was a lot of fun to talk with people and again, in the clouds, got to fly around a little bit. I'm currently in San Francisco, and then I'm headed back to Los Angeles later today. So lots of great conversations. I got to go to Dev Day by OpenAI this week and just kind of hear about all these things that people are working on or
Which
thinking
one?
about working on. But it's been fun. It's been fun.
Awesome, thanks. Over to George. George, I have seen you somewhere in the near future, in the past. You have been sitting very close to Ferrari. Where you are at that time, I see your tweet on that day, and where you are currently, and how where you are busy these days.
Yeah, I'm not wearing my McLaren stuff, but hi, I'm George Castro. I'm on the projects team at the CNCF, kind of one of Taylor's teammates here, um, and mostly just kind of happy to be here. I help work with some of the over 200 CNCF projects, and hopefully trying to gather as much of the best practice and share across as many projects as possible with the least amount of friction. Um, so I could talk about this stuff all day.
Awesome, awesome, absolutely. So, Josh, can you share the screen? We can set the stage. So, people, this is the communication for you. We
Yeah.
saw I will work with Taylor. We chatting about for a very long time. We are missing some content around communication pattern for cloud native success. Like there are
Yeah.
so many tools. There are so many opinionated approaches. There is so many options, and also I don't think so in today's world there's any problem running any project locally or in the production environment. I think the bigger problem is aligning people with technology and making sure everybody has on same page with us. So today we're talking about how to communicate with non-stakeholder, how to communicate with senior members of the team, and especially who we are talking to them. And one of the most common pitfall we see the engineering face is assuming everyone has the same technical context, but in reality, we must adopt our messages based on whom we are talking to. So I
Mhm.
hope in a few seconds our slides will be appear on the screen. George, can you actually
Sorry,
pull?
I had them prepped and then I clicked on the wrong thing while you were talking about technical competence. I was like, I failed that.
See, but this is perfect.
Uh,
This is how teams communicate, you call things
Yeah,
out. This is kind of what we're talking about today.
yeah,
absolutely.
I,
So
I
we
want
just
you.
need.
There you go.
Oh, awesome. Yes, it's now visible perfectly for me. I hope I look up the messages if the people have some problem, but I can see it perfectly fine. I hope Taylor and George also see on their screen as well. It's perfectly visible. So George, can you go into the next few slides? We can give us a quick intro of ourselves. We already did.
Sure. Here we
Yes.
go.
So Taylor, this is your now quick professional intro for time.
Yeah, happy to meet all of you. My name is Taylor Dolezal. I'm the head of ecosystem here at the CNCF. I get to talk with a whole bunch of end users about how they're adopting cloud native and then figuring out programs, assets, research, and all kinds of other things to help end users actually work within the cloud. We recently spun up our end user technical advisory board last year, at the end of last year. And they've also been a wonderful group of people just helping out the community and figuring out what all of you end users need.
Awesome, awesome. So, hello, friends. My name is Saim Safdar. I'm currently a CNCF ambassador. Apart from that, I'm also running a community called Cloud Native Islamabad. And last day, actually, I hosted 51st webinar, and that's about cargo. You can watch that as well. And I covered 24 CNCF open source project from 2020 to up till now, on a lot of the coverage around what these projects do, what are the use cases, when you should use one, what are the ways you can communicate with the community if you want to contribute to these open source as well. And previously, in the last few years, I actually I started a podcast named Cloud Native FM. That's basically wanted to know where the community is heading towards to, what are the problems people are facing, what are the technological complexities, and some of the human complexity as well. So it's also available on the YouTube as Cloud Native FM. And also, I spent some of my time in the past working in some of the companies as a developer relations and some of the other stuff as well. So, George, can you click on the next slide?
I got you.
Thank you very much, George. So I think I will. Why communication is important in software engineering and journals. So my wisdom was telling me you have to build a shared wisdom. Everybody should be on the same page. And we need to collect some requirement from the business, from the non-technical stakeholder, from the senior execs, from the leaders. For everybody, we can collect information. So understanding the requirement is another bigger pillar for the communication. Then there's a collaboration efficiency. We want to communicate in a way that I am actually visible. I'm telling to the people right set of requirement so other people, team member can work on that. And eventually we want to become a problem solver for our customers, for other community as well. So and we want to share our knowledge with the community, with our colleagues, with our best friends about to share the collective wisdom. So now, are we tracking what need to be tracked? And I've seen in a lot of organizations, sometimes there's a siloed communication, and sometimes the communication, our flow happen all the time, where you're always speaking to everyone and nothing is happening. And sometimes you're not communicating efficiently enough, and when there is outage, there's everybody jumping on the call and trying to fix this up as well. So Taylor, can you tell us what are some of the areas or some of the communications paradigms you have seen in your careers in the previous companies and currently now when you're talking to the end user communities in the CNCF?
I think taking a look at some of the communication patterns, I think when it comes to our community within the CNCF and across all of these differing projects, it's really about what kind of experience or comprehension you have about things, right? If you're somebody that is kind of used to working on like a toy app or a weekend demo or something, an MVP, something for work or your team, you're really used to contributing code, pushing things up. You might be merging in pull requests yourself, but and you can go really fast, right? You don't really need to communicate with anyone other than yourself. Maybe you're leaving yourself comments and notes and writing a README so that you can remember tomorrow what you did today, and those kinds of things. So there's all differing kinds of paradigms of communication. As you start to move, like, okay, your demo works nice. You've got your code to a decent spot where you can show things off to people. You start working across teams, maybe within your organization or elsewhere. Then you start to see a differing pattern take place. You have to call things out. You might be working with one or more people in delivering features, or people asking questions, finding a bug report, something like that. And then you start to see things like GitHub issues come up, or emails or Slack messages and these other things. And you kind of got to have a sense for how to put that together as well. Do you file that as a GitHub bug? Do you write that in your notebook? You have to figure out where some of those things are stored and how they persist in a different way. And then call that out to people that you're working with too, right? You can't just kind of put your blinders on and be working with something so intimately and not sharing out with people. And then when you scale to the larger community, you're working on open source projects. I think that's the thing that a lot of people are surprised about when they first started getting involved in open source is, oh my gosh, I have to, it's a lot more conversation than it is code. And that's true, right? Because we need to make sure all the pieces fit, the code makes sense, it's documented, the tests pass, all of these things are considered. The larger and larger a project that you work on, and the larger and larger the community that you work with. So when it takes 2 weeks to get a pull request merged in, that is a lot more regular than if you're working on something by yourself. We get to go far as a community. You can move fast individually, but it takes the community to move far, get that adoption and everything else too.
Awesome, absolutely. And I think like when I think the when everybody's take up, I think that the key factor for the communication is when you do it effectively, you have a happy developer in your team, you have a shared vision. And if effective communication, I have seen all the organization I happen to work with, there is a successful project outcome at the end of the day. And then open dialogue contribute to the problem solving and the quality of enhancement as well. But I often see, especially in the cloud native space, that most common my observation is like whenever we talk to everyone, we see they might be understanding GitHub, let's say Argo CD. They're understanding Prometheus, they understand Grafana, they understand Kubernetes, but not that the case. Everybody has their different context, different background, and we must need to adopt our messages based on whom we are talking to as well. And I pass over to the George. George, what your observations are, because you worked in some other companies in the past as well.
Yeah.
What are some of the if communication hurdles you have seen in the companies?
Yeah. So one of the things you mentioned, it's like some people might not be experts in the things that you're talking about. I've also found that even if they are the authors of the thing that you're talking about, they don't have context in how you're using it, how it's configured, maybe how your customers are using it, or that kind of stuff. So sometimes, like I've sat in meetings where like the person who wrote the stuff still needs to spin up on the tech, and that's also why I have tenets, that I try to recommend to projects, and like the importance of asynchronous communications, I think is important. Always assume that the person you're talking to is on the other side of the world. And even though it's counterintuitive, right? Because you're like, I've got limited time, I've got stuff to do, I want to be as efficient as possible. And it feels slow, right? If you're doing asynchronous, it just feels so slow. But I think the pattern we've seen, and it's proven itself time and time and time again, is going together is like it's like a marathon, not a sprint. So even though it might feel counterintuitive at first, just the fact that you're forcing the discussion to be asynchronous in a place where everyone can see, where everyone has time to respond, because you're asking me a deeply technical comment and I'm in the middle of a meeting and it goes off in Slack. What do people tend to do? Right? They kind of try to half answer it. And now you've got two problems. You're half as effective in the meeting you're in, and you're half as effective as at completing the issue. So I'm very much of a asynchronous pusher. And the thing, looking at the slide, I think that the way I kind of have the motivation in my back of my head is communication inefficiency tends to cost us so much money that we're not aware of, right? Like, so things like, if something is important, adding a note to the invite email that, hey, look, there's going to be over 10 people at this call. For startups, this is a startup lesson. If there's over 5 people in a call, that's going to be very, very, very expensive for us. So sending in the invite, like, look, here's the agenda, here's the prep material, and kind of give people expectations of like, when we're in these meetings, we're trying to be efficient, but we're also trying to have a good time and get to know each other and stuff. Right. So there's like that balance. You don't want to run meetings that are so strict that nobody wants to show up because they're all business all the time either. So there's that balance there. But I also try to think of the cost of not just dollar wise, but people's time. And that always translates to a dollar cost for organizations. And part of the reason open source succeeds is we're striving to be as efficient as possible with the organizations that support us, their time, their resources, and things like that. So I always have that in the back of my head as to, I have to solve all of these things on that slide, but we also can't sit around for the first 25 minutes to get everyone up to speed on a thing. So I always try to find little hacks, little tricks. Maybe you can, that's the importance of having notes in the continuity of of discussions, right? It's like, oh no, the host went on holiday for 2 weeks, right? And now that entire meeting is useless for 2 weeks until they come back, get everything going. So those are the kind of uh, ecosystem impacts of having bad communication. I try to think about the ripple effect that it could have on engineers and other contributors.
Yes, absolutely. I totally agree with you. And George, can you go to the next slide, please?
All right.
Because awesome, it's great. So I think, like as you mentioned, like having effective communication adds up your cost as well. Like I've seen all of the projects who have been successful, even in the open source side and even on the organization side, is the effective communication played a vital role. I think the number one catalyst for their success as well. But when working with the organization, you have to go through hierarchies. You have senior executive, you have team leads, then internal you have a team leader within your team, and then eventually, I think for what I've seen for my last 6-7 year working in different companies, you never been in your life where you are not a part of a team where it's somebody is not accountable for. You have to be accountable for some of your bosses, some of your leader. You can't work with isolation in the organization. And some might blame, like if you could start communicating, this slows you down because sometimes the pipeline is like this. I send an email to my team leader and it doesn't reply. He's asking, this is not my job. Let me talk to my boss. And that is say, let me talk to my boss. And eventually this is a 3-month delay and nothing been happening. So I want to pass this info for my friend Taylor, because he is a Kubernetes release lead from the open source side, where he tell us about some of the communication pattern in open source, and also he's a work as a developer advocate in the HashiCorp as well. We know about this HashiCorp from the Terraform world as well. But Taylor, can you tell us in a hierarchy, what are some of the delays, where the delays can come from, and what are the ways we can actually start doing some effective communication with our team leaders?
Absolutely. So it's kind of funny. It all kind of comes full circle here. George is actually the one that I got started working with. He was one of the people I worked with. I think it was Kubernetes release 114 when I got started on that front, when I was a release communication shadow. So, things go in circles here, right? It's a big old feedback loop. And also, I think I worked with Jobs' position, at least at a couple jobs, not related to Steve Jobs. But I think when you take a look at interacting, I like what George said about thinking about how to communicate asynchronously. Kubernetes specifically had we would have a meeting every, as we got closer to the release being cut, those meetings would be more and more frequent so we could surface things. And that synchronous communication was really important closer to the deadline. When we were further out from that, we would utilize Slack, GitHub issues, and communicating on that front. And then our Git commits, making their way in. We had dashboards, and I kind of had some understanding as far as how those tests were running and what the schedule was, what features we cared about, were blog posts done. There's a lot of work that needed to be done across all these different teams, each of them skilled or tasked with a specific area. And then they kind of had to develop those skills or pull at those skills and talents that they had. So Kubernetes specifically has like communications, bug triage, all of these differing roles to help tie things together. And to your point, Sam, I liked how I like kind of how you framed the hierarchy on this front too, is, if you think about people as distributed systems, you're going to bounce your API request back up, down, forth. Sometimes you just want to communicate with a database or a cache, or be able to load a web page without bouncing back and forth. Imagine loading a web page and it says, hold on, I need to wait for my manager. It's like, oh, they're on vacation. Sorry, you can't load up this web page for 2 weeks. That's not going to work, right? So empowering teams to be effective on their own is really important. You do have a leader and you can bubble things up when the time is right, but that shouldn't be the default pattern. Is let me get permission, let me sit and wait. The best kinds of teams that I've seen in my career are the ones that can be autonomous. They don't run into bottlenecks unless there are some really important things that they see as impacting the whole organization or team or project. Then it's important. kind of like with the Kubernetes releases. Makes sense to bubble those things up and have synchronous calls with the whole team there as we're really close to the release, because it's a very important many hands on deck type thing. When you're working on like, okay, maybe we should work on a blog post or something like that. Depending on the kind of blog post, that's you should be able to do that individually or with that team, and then kind of figure out what that communication pattern looks like. When I used to work at HashiCorp and Disney and all of those other areas too, we would like to, so like HashiCorp, it was more about like open source projects and communicating things out on that front. Here are some new features. We would, when Terraform would go through a new release, we would have a webinar or office hours to talk about what was in that. That was a good way to communicate out to the community about these new things that they could do, show off a demo and some cool things on that front. When I was at Disney and I wasn't, I was doing a lot more inner source, open source work rather than sharing out with a broader community outside the organization. We would communicate things out like, hey, we just released a new Terraform module or package or something on the infrastructure team, or would go out to differing developer teams to talk about, here's some platform services that we offer now. Here's some updates that we went through, and then to kind of have like a feedback loop with them and saying, okay, here's version 1.5. Is this, are you enjoying it so far? Is there anything you want to see? And it was a great conversation back and forth with, and really evangelism, working with those developer teams, taking that back to the infrastructure team, and then implementing those suggestions or tools or making the documentation clear. Even though you have a hierarchy, that doesn't mean that it's everything forced down all the time. Think about it as systems. It's a distributed system. People don't have DNS, at least that we've seen or found so far, but you get this feedback loop type thing going on. You can bubble up. You can talk to the person at the top of the hierarchy, jump over here to the side and talk with that team. It isn't a static kind of force-directed graph with communication. Break out of the norms. Talk with more and more people as you can and where it makes sense. If you don't know, the only thing you can do is ask.
Absolutely. And I think one thing I really like about the Kubernetes community in general is that they bring up with Chag app delivery and some other groups within the CNC, within the Kubernetes, there are different groups for API, machinery, storage, networking, compute capacity. I haven't seen those things have replicating in the organization, but if I see that spun up, because sometimes happening is you communicating more often with the business leader, and business leader doesn't tell you how to implement Prometheus and Grafana. And sometimes you actually, the business leader is talk to the engineering where they don't have the knowledge to sell the product for your customers. So if you spin up teams within the Kubernetes like system where you have an engineering leader that need to decide which feature roll in and roll out, and then they communicate back to the executive on selling paradigm to how to effectively sell those kind of thing as well. So I think this is a very nice thing to have as well. But I do call out Rahul is with us on the chat as well. It was great to meet you and learn more about cloud native. Thanks, Rahul. It always glad to see people in the chat as well. So George, can you what's your take on this hierarchy? Because sometimes people say it's slowing us down. You are slowing us down.
So go further. It's interesting that you're mentioning all the things in the release process, right? And I remember when they started the release team, right? And it just reminds me of the importance of organizational knowledge and expertise that you build over time, right? Like anyone who's ever been on a release team is like, oh, I think I was on the worst one, right? Because you're like self-critical, and we always do postmortems. I don't know how often they're doing postmortems these days, right? But also, I think one of the great things about the pattern is we know we're going to release Kubernetes twice a year around the same general time, right? The investment that the release team put in their shadow program, right, was a thing, because when you onboard and you're shadow, you don't really know anything. So almost your only job is just to write stuff down and to kind of like ensure that like nothing gets slipped in between the agenda items or whatever. And I think it just shows the power of repetition, best practice, and documenting stuff. It kind of ends up being basic stuff, right? But that's very difficult to explain to people who may not be there already, right? But we also have to realize it took us a decade to get there, right? Like when Kubernetes started releasing, I don't even think, when was the first community release of Kubernetes that was outside of Google, right? Even that took a long time, you know? So, you know, documenting all the ways, you know, all right, you know, at some point, somewhere in a release, you said, you know what? Release date minus 4 weeks or whatever is when we should be pinging these separate tags, these separate things. You know, marketing people always wants a heads up. What is that? -3, -4? Well, let's try -4 and tweak it next time if it doesn't work. You know, and you're constantly adjusting these little knobs, right? To get to the end. However, you know, also the rate of change and things that are going into separate components and things like that also means that you can't just leave it the way it is always, right? So it's almost like you're tuning the engine while it's running. You kind of never really have a chance for a pit stop, right?
Yeah.
So that's also, I think, the importance of getting as many people in there as possible and splitting the load. It's just like a cluster, right? Splitting the load with as many people as possible to figure out how to tweak all the little things just right. And then the difficult thing that you're actually trying to ask is, however, at work, we're organized like this, right? So
Sorry to interrupt you, George, but there are
Yeah.
some questions popping up.
yeah. I just rambled. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Time gate, the people who talk too much in your meetings is a
It's a feature gate. Yeah.
yeah.
Absolutely. But there are wonderful. There are people are popping in and asking questions, and this is session actually for them to actually understand
Yeah.
what their pain point are. One of the questions they are talking about us, Vijay Kumar is asking, could you share insight into how features in Kubernetes move from alpha to beta to stable? Thankfully, so I know there are some documentation is already available on the internet. But can you, because you're both part of the release team, can you share some few quick insight into this process?
Yeah, I can take a crack at it. And George, if you want to keep me honest,
Actually, wait, read his second question also. And because
Yes.
Taylor's going to go where he's asking next.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. So you read the Taylor mind. Great job, George. Awesome.
Yeah.
So how does the community ensure that the feature graduation remains aligned with real world production use cases?
I love that. So the way that features make their way into Kubernetes is not just, you know, someone has an idea and done, right? It's a lot more complex than that. And you called that out perfectly with alpha, beta, and then GA, you know, when it's ready and stable. To get a feature even into and accepted at the alpha stage, people have to write what's called a KEP, or Kubernetes Enhancement Proposal. I believe that came from like Python and PEPs and kind of like basically calling things out and sharing what is the intent, what's the purpose. It allows, again, this communication pattern, the community to talk about things and talk about the implementation, any risks associated with that, benefits associated with that. The community, you know, at large acts to keep people honest and saying like, oh, hey, we have this feature already, or have you tried this pattern, or right? We don't want to overload Kubernetes with everything that every idea that everyone has, because it might not make sense, or there might be another way to go about doing that. I'm blanking on some of the specifics as far as alpha to beta to stable. I know that alpha, once a feature makes its way into alpha, then you have to turn on a feature flag to be able to utilize that within your kubelet and within like your Kubernetes control plane. When it goes from alpha to beta, then it's turned on by default, but you have to show it's been tested. There's community engagement, like the community wants to see something move from alpha to beta. You have to prove that and show that. And then when it moves from beta to stable, there's a whole bunch of due diligence in between all of those steps. And yeah, we have some of that here. And so graduation criteria, there are sites to take a look at which features are in which state too. And then right now, I know the community's been talking a lot about, you know, hey, how do we actually make sense of where everything is at, and when does it make sense to maybe sunset something that made it into alpha but isn't getting the traction it needs, etc.
Awesome. Thank you, Taylor. And thanks, George, for popping that up. I think I love once Kubernetes community added these portions as well that the George is saying. So George,
we used to not have this. You have to just know the person.
See, communication help.
Yeah. So what I love about this is you get the number for everything. You see the state, you see the authors and the stakeholders. And then as I showed you in some of these, like they really go through a lot of detail on what it takes to go to beta to alpha. I'm sorry, alpha to beta to production where appropriate. And the deprecation policy is the second half of this, right? Which is when a thing gets deprecated. What is it? 18 months? I can't remember when it's written down. I forget what it is, unfortunately. But by following this kind of stuff is kind of shows you the process that is going through for each of the features that you've landed. So, for example, is there a KEP for dynamic resource allocate? I'm pretty sure there is. This was a popular one, right? And when that person asks about how do you ensure what things match what people actually want in production, is they get involved at this step right here, right? And the earlier you get involved in this process, the more agency, I guess, you have in seeing if that feature is going to be useful for you. This is an example of a KEP that everybody in the industry was interested in, right? This is slicing and dicing GPUs in a better way so AI workloads run better in Kubernetes, right? Like everybody wants this. So this is just an example of something that, I mean, look at the size of my scroll thinger, right? Like you can just go all day. And I wanted to bring this up in the concept of communications. Oh, this is on kubernetes.dev, by the way.
Yes.
Like when we did not have this, things were really, really bad, right? We could say bad, but also it was before we had this was some of Kubernetes' fastest growth, you know? So you can look at some of the things that we've built after huge growth spurts as like, okay, let's not do that again. We should probably start writing everything down, right? Like I can almost guarantee someone was like, we need to have an enhancement process, right? Because people have seen these in Python, right? And I think you see this especially in larger projects now, right? Yes. Things like enhancement proposals. We now have better tooling around GitHub issue templates, right? Like pull request templates and things like that that have just really kind of been popularized over the past 10 years, right? Yeah. So now we have a separate problem, which is now we have so many tools to communicate the state of a thing, right? You know, like if someone doesn't know this site exists and they end up only reading the GitHub issues, they're going to get a partial picture instead of a full picture. And if you only read the KEP without probably checking all of the GitHub issues that were filed in that entire section of Kubernetes, you're also missing half the picture, right? Absolutely. So every time we add a new tool, it's great, you know, but it has to match things that these people can understand, you know. Absolutely. Okay, give me the 5-minute status on dynamic resource allocation, and then you'd return back with that kind of stuff. That, you know, now you're scaring your manager instead of putting them in a position to be able to help you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And I think like one of the things I'm actually interesting to see the way the Kubernetes community, not as a project, the community as a Kubernetes as a feature set, but how the Kubernetes community organize the project. Mm-hmm. If some organization can use that model that we're talking about, KEP model, I don't see an organization are doing that. If they do it, I believe this is going to be a wonderful ride for their business. You have to document everything because not all the feature that the customer wants, you end up in the production. You need some kind of wiring braining on that thing. Is this actually going to be help our customers or not? Because your customer can ask for something, but those are not implementers. So I would love to see how organization use the Kubernetes community hierarchy and they can use in their organization as well. But before we let go, I think in the next step, in the next few slides, we're answering some of the questions for one of the other question in the chat as well. But the Kamal Haskasana is saying, what trend do you see shaping the future of cloud native communication pattern? So I will actually pass that in we will definitely be answering this question because the next few slides are answering that part of the question. But we actually organized this slide because we know some of our people have joined us might be a techie heavy, a techie savvy. So we want to cover those guys as well. They're working on the technology as well. So I see, as we spoke about organizational hierarchy, some organization have their culture, and now we have application delivery. So one of the diagram in the left I'm actually sharing is a diagram from platform white paper that the CNCF guys have written out, I think 2 years back. And the right where organization culture belong. So our to Taylor, like we in the culture organizations, we have some sort of all the things we can wire up, and then there's an application delivery. I've seen there's a challenge of unifying both or even translating one from other.
I think that when it comes to, I'm kind of zooming out and thinking more. I like this discussion. I'm zooming out and kind of thinking more about kind of those trends and everything else that were asked about in the chat. When it comes to, sorry, just like full mind spark on this. It's all coming together for me. A while ago, I had posted some things on LinkedIn, and they were like differing roles and all about career success, right? Like, how do I get to level 7 or 3 or 4? How do I put together my engineering practice, for my career and everything I want to do in my life? And it blew up on LinkedIn. I was like, wow, I was really surprised that so many people found that valuable. It wasn't anything I had written. It was just sharing. I think it was from Dropbox. Then a couple months later, I forget what organization it was, released another kind of like matrix so that you could see like what level you were and all of the roles and responsibilities that came in that. And that also blew up. And I was like, okay, this isn't a mistake. This is something that people find is valuable. And kind of looking at, trends and communication, looking at Kubernetes is a good example. I shared, unfortunately, folks watching on LinkedIn, the link doesn't go through and publish, but if you check us out on YouTube, you'll see the link. Kubernetes, like George said, it took a decade to kind of figure out all of the pieces and the right teams and kind of how to fit together the culture and then how to deliver on all these things like bug reporting, CAPS features, etc. And it's because we created role books is, I think, one of the biggest things within Kubernetes that was given back to the community, clear lines that really helped line people up so they know what is expected of them and what isn't. Or they can look at other teams and see right, it's actually like looking up a definition. Like, what does this word mean? What does this team do? If you have something that's really clearly outlined, it just makes it that much easier to work with people like that. Same thing when you're a techie person and you're developing an API interface or something like that. If you have an endpoint and you're just like, you don't know what the shape of your payload looks like, that's horrible, right? You're just like, what am I supposed to get back? What am I supposed to send? And if it's just like 200 okay, that's not really useful. Same thing applies with people. If you're just kind of throwing things and it's like, this looks great, you don't really get good feedback back, that's not going to be helpful. So I think kind of looking to systems is a great example, having more statically typed conversations and kind of like, what do you expect going in to the meetings, the conversations, the communications? What do you expect coming out? Are you missing something? Do you need to go back and retry your request with people?
Awesome, absolutely. And I pass the next question to George. I think George has some insight into this as well. So, George, can you share some of the insight for the organization culture? Sometime, let's say, in some companies, you don't have a very compliance-oriented teams in the organization. You don't have any compliance in the organization who check out what we're throwing in production are compliance reliant or not. But we love tools using to have compliance and governance in place. But if there's some people who are watching us in that kind of category, but they know this is very important. We have a governance and automation and compliance is a big thing for the companies these days, but there's no one who can actually educate them about it. So have you think what are the companies using it? What are their model? What are their communication for that pattern? When there's no one who can help me out, you actually bombarded with everyone. Oh, can you help me out? Can you help me out? And you're talking to everyone. So in such kind of scenarios, what have you seen in the quite recently, and what you have seen continuously facing when we're talking with the community in general, and when we have some conversation in the KubeCon about that conversations?
Hmm. So are you asking how organizations figure out how to get their compliance
Yes,
in
I
order?
think
Or
just as an example, I'm saying, like, if
yeah.
organization culture versus application delivery, if there's nothing part of the organization culture but is part of application delivery, how do we
Hmm.
actually map those together?
Hmm. I have a weird experience because I either worked in open source, but then
Yes.
when I worked at a startup uh, for compliance, cloud custodian, they were already all bankers, so they kind of knew. Um, it is a very interesting problem though, because I think uh, part of the strength of open source and all of that good stuff is you can kind of do what you want, you know. Um, but then doing what you want can lead to bad things, right? So people write it down in compliance and things like that. And I don't really know an answer on how you would do this, other than I do have a separate insight though, is that um it is a thing that we are talking about more recently than we have in the past, like especially since Paris. Europe passing data sovereignty laws, right? And before it was like the only people that care compliance. Why do we care about this? We're not selling to the government or the military, right? And every year it comes on, there's another industry that just starts to become, you know, more and more caring about compliance, right? The entire healthcare industry, right? So in a way, compliance is making its way out of those highly regulated industries into kind of you know, Node app dev who just wants to push to production that day. Um, I don't really have an answer on the best way to communicate that, other than the conversations that I have been kind of keeping track of are good and fruitful, right? Like the amount of compliance tools that we have in the CNCF, right, is pretty impressive, right? You have um, and things that are kind of born out of compliance, right? Like FinOps is basically compliance. You just don't want to spend money. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to trivialize what FinOps is trying to do, right? But it's like if you're compliant, you also save a bunch of money because you're not wasting resources on things that you shouldn't be running in the first place, right? So in a way, a lot of modern cloud stuff kind of falls under compliance, right? It just depends, like, who do you have to listen to, right? Is it your company's internal compliance? Is it a government thing? Is it a data thing based because of customer data, PII, and all that kind of stuff that like gets really complicated, right? And then you try to normalize that with this chart that you see here on the left, right? This is, I don't really have any insight on, I haven't sat in on a talk that was like, how we got into compliance. Like there are talks that are like that, but so much of this stuff is organization dependent on how they're organized internally, right? And
Absolutely.
yeah,
I'd
it's
say
just so tied into the business aspect, and not our infrastructure is very cookie cutter,
Yes.
yeah.
right? And like that's one of those problems that I hate it when people say it depends, right? But this is the ultimate. It depends to me.
It's
Yeah,
Absolutely. And George, can you go to the next few slide, and then
I got you.
I let
Yeah.
people, I let Taylor talk about. Over to you, Taylor.
Ooh, yeah. Good one.
Yeah, I think when it comes to compliance too, I like what you said, George. I agree, and I think where we spin our wheels collectively, whether people setting the compliance or people trying to enact it, it's just again you're getting into that communication pattern. If you don't understand the why behind it, it's really hard to bring it forward and actually implement it. Right? If you're like, okay, we have to keep our logs around for 10 years. Why? Oh yeah, never mind. We actually don't. It's just 2 months. So like. And I think healthy pushback is important on that front too. Not being adversarial, but respectfully disagreeing and kind of pushing that, asking why. If you don't have a clear answer as to why you're doing something, I'd argue you shouldn't be doing it, within reason. But I think it's always important to have an understanding of what's going on, especially with enacting that kind of thing and making sure that we get it right so that we're not spinning our wheels or wasting money, like George was saying.
Absolutely. And I think like one of the things that we notice in the Cloud Native Community Foundation in general, like we know, understand, we build up like in compliance as we talk about in the security. We have so many umbrella tool, Open Policy Agent, Kyverno. Now we have a GitOps tooling in place. Cloud native tooling is everywhere. A lot of the businesses are using for the real customers' problem, and we understand this. And by using the technology is just one thing. Aligning technology with the people is another thing. And we know this is a problem in the industry everywhere. And that's where the cloud native folks came up with the cloud native trial map. So that's basically we understanding that we using the technology today. In day two, you came up with other technologies, and it's crumpling up. You always using new tools to solve traditional problem, and then you are actually having different teams who are aligning that part of that debate as well. So that's a real one of the momentum. George, can you go to the next slide, please? Because I feel like a lot of the organization will live with this diagram. I have been going through such a where we have different teams and they are communicating somewhat unified language, but they are having everybody have their different opinions. You have developers in your team, you have solutions architect, project manager, then you have a typical developers who work with the patterns in the software delivery, making sure things are reusable, things are shareable across the team member. Then you have a change implication, then there are SRE team, then there's a platform team, and then there is a security team in place. So this is what I feel like a typical organizational headache and an individual headache as well, where different team member, and that's why we actually arranged this topic, because if you live in this world, communication is one thing that actually screwed you down, and one thing that you make you a very successful in this paradigm as well. But I will try to go into some of the question actually arise quite recently. Are there safeguard in place? Troy Jensen is asking, are there safeguard in place to ensure malicious actor don't insert Trojan horses or deficiencies in code? How do you avoid something like 4J? I will pass that to my panelists, but I think this is very easy today. We have policy as code tools. Before deploying into the production, you can write a policy in front of the developers. So that policy says there's something like that couldn't never ever go into the production environment. So you can add those policies in front of the machine without any deploying to the production, and you are in the phase. So, but I think some of the people feel like in the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, do not fight with production. Make sure stuff that pollute the production doesn't go there. So we actually it's a security left or shift down approach as well. But I pass over to George and Taylor to tell us like these are the very good, similar to CrowdStrike events. Like how do we prevent it?
Yeah, I'd say that it's I really agree with what you're saying, Saim, and that's what I've seen throughout my career is that we have a whole bunch of people all doing, all really skilled at various things, and you've called them out in this chart here too, whether it's security, development, infrastructure, policy setting, all of these differing roles. Even though we're completely different with our skills and our understanding in some areas, how do we work together? It's having that common language. It's that unified, kind of speech, language, pattern, understanding of our world. It's kind of understanding what you're, if you were a puzzle piece, what is your shape? What do you look like? And then can you fit with this other team with all your skills, talents, and abilities? Some people might be good at several things, and that's really good. The more you can understand, knowledge is power. It's really helpful, especially when it comes to getting something to production, as well as understanding some outages and other things too that might have happened, not with you, but in the past in general. This is where it really happens, right? Is that understanding, having a shared language, looking at things that we have, like OCI, Open Container Interface, or CSI for storage, CNI for networking. I think that's where a lot of the value add is within the open source community are these standards that we have, so that it gives us a map of how things connect together from an infrastructure or development standpoint. I think it's important to kind of create what those interfaces and what your interactions between your teams looks like. Not that it has to be forced, like you didn't say, hi to me in this kind of way. It shouldn't be a script, right? It should be there to allow for maximum throughput with your communications. And I kind of like what you're calling out here. But as you're going and shaping that, if you just like Kubernetes, it's been around for a decade now, and a little over a decade. And there are all of these roles defined. Think about doing that for your team, your company, yourself. If you have a project you're working on and it's not bound in any kind of way, shape, or form, it's really hard to get it done because you don't know where the edges are. Figure out where the edges are and then work your way in. And then you can really be a lot more effective as a person, as an individual, and as an organization when you interact with others.
Absolutely, absolutely. I remember back in the day, my childhood, I actually purchased a bubble, and it gives me a one puzzle piece. And then I have a chat board in my home where I need to pick up the puzzle where actually is fit in that chart. So I buy actually 200 bubble or 300 bubble just to complete the puzzle, and at the end of the game, give me some trophy as a reward. So I see the Cloud Native Computing Foundation is similar to like that. Now you have a puzzle piece is fill in. I believe as of today, we know if we have a come across policy and compliance, we need these tools. If we come up around GitOps, we need these tools. So this puzzle piece is fill in. Now you need to understand what sort of skill within your organization currently have that can implement those skills, and with an effective communication that everybody understands the importance of security policies, that the things like Log4j or CrowdStrike eventually doesn't fall into our trap of where we actually do a forensic out of it as well. But unfortunately, we're actually running out of time, but the questions keep popping up. So George, can you go to the next few slides? We can wrap up. We're just having 8 minutes left for us. Vijay is asking, in high pressure scenarios such as incident management or post-incident review, how can empathy ops help teams collaborate more effectively and avoid the blame game, especially when issues cross multiple domain, infrastructure, security, and code? Love the question, and I pass over to George.
Man, this is organizational culture, 100%, and I think it starts with the leadership, right? This is one of the questions when I am interviewing for a job, and when I recommend people interviewing for a job, especially in ops, ask what the postmortem culture looks like, right? And it should be, how do we put ourselves in this position? And that if you find a place, that has the kind of blame game going on, like, generally speaking, those aren't high performing teams, right? I'm sure there's rare cases everywhere, but documenting postmortem, there is no blame. Like, the amount of times that would have absolutely happened to me. I would have blown away 2 databases if instead of Taylor only blew away 1. So I think it's one of those things where every time that happens, you examine the process, right? Like the things that we mentioned in the Kubernetes release thing was due to postmortems, right? Like, there was a time, one of the most popular blog posts we ever wrote was clarification on the Docker deprecation in Kubernetes because we communicated it poorly. So the community thought that, like, we were removing container support from Kubernetes for a little while there, and we had to do we should get a blog post out. It was 8:00 at night, and it was like, how do we put ourselves in this situation? And that's how you end up with that process. So it's the same thing with like security or an outage, or why did we miss these deadlines? How can we be 2 cycles behind on this critical feature? Those kind of questions that you're asking, I look at high performance teams, and not just in software too. It's like you see the same thing in sports, where like the older days is very, very yelly, and now these days the teams that understand how to lift each other up, right, tend to be more successful. And that's the pattern I try to bring and recommend to folks And usually I ask her, one of the things I ask around at KubeCon is like, who knows this stuff better than anyone, you know? And then someone always almost has, you should talk to so-and-so, they're a manager at this company and they've dealt with crisis. You should just go ask them. And that's one of the values of going to an event, right? Is to hear it from someone who like went through it, you know?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a stream like this with 13,000 people. And so you could go.
Yeah, except it's way funnier because it's usually way after, right? Like, I was talking to somebody at a very large entertainment company, and they had a streaming service outage during a very large thing. And then the postmortem they shared afterwards was just fantastic, right? And these days it's really cool when they publish it as a blog post and take that as an opportunity to see. I see it as a flex. I think traditionally management stuff will be like, oh no, we're going to look like fools or whatever, right? Whereas me, I'm like, let me see how a group of professionals handles an emergency. I want to see the kind of NORAD style, like what is it they're doing that leads them to their success, right? And then, you know,
absolutely
remember.
And awesome, absolutely. So we have just 5 minutes left to Taylor. You try to recap, and yes, let's go to the next slide.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah.
Try to recap and give some final key takeaways from all this conversation. I think we can talk hour. This is our favorite subject of all of three. We can go there until KubeCon November 14th to 12:15. Yeah. But we need to actually stop, unfortunately, in a few minutes. So, Trader, can you try to recap and give us some final wisdom of where we should go from there?
Absolutely. I think really to sum it up is, you know, when you're taking a look at empathy ops and trying to like bring that into your processes, it can be a difficult exercise to think back through your career, especially if you've been in tech for a longer amount of time. What does beginner look like all the way up to where you're at right now, right? But the way that you saw the world, you had a different lens at any given point in time. And so really trying to think about why that is, or like pull that apart, like really, really think critically about that and what you needed, what your motivations were, kind of thinking back through time with your perspective now is, I think, something that can be really helpful as you look at the processes in your team. Totally human, totally natural to get frustrated or upset or all these other things too. But at the end of the day, if you can make a place where your team feels safe and available to be able to bring some of the things that might be problems in the future to you, that's always going to be better than people that are fearful or scared, you know. So at next time that you're interacting with an intern or somebody else that just got added to the team and they make a mistake, you know, think twice about that. Think about, like George said, the process. Did we make this clear enough? Is this something where, you know, education or something else might be helpful? Or did everybody just get used to this process and we just kind of have all internalized it and we haven't made it clear or communicated this out? I think that thinking through that really will help. And you kind of see this shift here. This graph is really kind of on the nose as well. You know, this is the path that a lot of people take in open source, is going from consumer, using things, reading docs, and just kind of like fully ingesting it, getting all the way from participant, contributor, and then up to leader as well, right? You kind of have to learn before you can scale up and start to contribute. If you don't know where you're going, it's really hard to chart a path.
Absolutely, absolutely. So George, can you go to the next slides? We can wrap up all the things discussed. So I think like as Taylor and George give us some wonderful insight into this as well. And I think I appreciate George words around documentation is very important. The way whatever
just write everything down. It's better to write everything down and not use it than when it's an emergency and you're in a hurry and not have it. Keeping in mind that might be someone else 3 years later. That's how organizations get that knowledge. It's organizational knowledge.
Yeah, be all right, not all wrong. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that the linking those documents together is also a big thing for us, because having 20,000 document and not linkage with that is a scrolling when you actually in an incident management system kind of things to go through as well. But I try to give us, you know, we have in CNCF tag app delivery tag for technical advisory group, and it has a website as well, tagappdelivery.cncf.io/working group. So these working group is to make sure how the organization can align the strategies in this, and how to align the tooling and everything in between, so they can be successful in their production environment and solving the business problem. And one of that group is CNCF Platform Working Group. We write papers and one of the key area which we're spending a lot of time is communication patterns. We know this is a problem. Is technology. Everybody can run Terraform. Anybody can run GitOps. Anybody can run Kubernetes and cluster wherever they are. But having those clear wisdom of where we are and where we want to be is a next big step. Everybody need to go through it. So I kind of recap. If you want to join the platform working group, there's a calendars available for you as well. We write white paper. There's a maturity model, and the next team is working on interviewing folks from the industry on the platform as a product approach and platform risk assessment. So I do want to call out these efforts for you. I have to be visible. This is another way of communicating that there's stuff happening. If you don't know about it, you need to know about this, and you need to join the community that is actually heading towards as well. But I think it's been a super productive session for me, especially every time I connect with George and Taylor. They give me wonderful knowledge around this kind of stuff, and hopefully we can come up with another topic, because this is some of the conversations is missing in journal in the community, and we would try to recap, might be in the next year as well. But it's a very productive session. I hope we cover all the questions in the chat, and it's always nice to see people when we're actually talking to them as well. So if you have more question, George, Taylor will be at the KubeCon Salt Lake. So make sure if you are attending, there are a bunch of wonderful co-located event happening. One is called Platform Working Group, WASMCon, OpenTelemetry, and all these kind of stuff as well. George, can you go to the next slide where we have some information around KubeCon? Yes. So make sure November 12 and November 15, if you are attending, make sure these guys are the best to meet in person. I haven't got the opportunity to meet those guys in person. So if you are there, make sure you are actually attending these kind of event as well, and talking to them about, they have a very good knowledge around this subject as well. So glad. Troy is saying, excellent session, great content and delivery. Thank you very much. This boosts up our motivation for the near future as well. As always, glad to have you. We're top of the hour, I think 2 minutes up, but we enjoy every conversation we have. Thank you everyone for joining us. And thank you, Taylor and George, for sharing your insights.
If you're coming to Salt Lake, come find us. Love to talk your ear off about this stuff.